Hey everybody, welcome to Period 3, Shaping a New Republic, Part 2, Lesson 310. Same objective as yesterday. We're going to explain how and why political ideas, institutions, and party systems developed and changed during the new republic. So we're looking to see in these years how some of the parts of our politics today first emerged. So we're going to talk about precedents during the Washington administration. And precedents mean traditions that are started by the president that are still followed today. And Washington, as the first president, was elected in 1789. And when he became president, he decided that executive power should be collaborative. It shouldn't be entirely held in the hands of a single individual. So Washington creates the executive departments, four government departments which will assist and advise him on the work of governing. And those departments included the Department of State, which handles foreign relations, the Department of War, which handles the military and conflicts, the Department of the Treasury, which handled the nation's finances, and the Department of Justice, which handles enforcement of the law. Those are the four areas that Washington felt he would need assistance and a group of individuals to assist him. In addition, he created a precedent of the presidential cabinet. And the cabinet is a group of advisors the president surrounded himself with, who he would consult on policy, and they would debate and deliberate and discuss what decisions should be made. In addition, each cabinet member headed one of the departments. So the Secretary of State was in charge of the State Department. The Secretary of Treasury was in charge of the Treasury Department. And that cabinet was a very collaborative body, with it noted that ultimately the president has the final decision making. But early presidents like Washington relied on their cabinets and generally respected and followed their advice. The third precedent Washington created is the inaugural address. He's established the idea that when a new president is sworn in or inaugurated into office, they give a speech which outlines their goals and objectives for the next 4 years of their presidency. And today, inaugural addresses are a very important part of the president's career because that's where they actually set out their goals for what they want to do. And finally, Washington set the precedent that no president should serve more than 2 terms. He felt like if a president lasted longer than 2 terms, they verged on becoming a monarch, and we didn't need that in the United States. That will later become part of the Constitution through the 22nd Amendment. But for most of our country's history, presidents simply respected Washington's request that no president serve more than 2 terms. The next president that followed Washington was John Adams. He was a Federalist, and John Adams comes into power, and he immediately inherits a problem called the Quasi-War, which means unofficial war between the United States and France. France was attacking our ships at sea, and we were trying to trade with Europe. Congress never declared war. The French government never declared war, but we were at war. So Adams used the military and organized the army and sent the Navy out to defend American shipping, which established the precedent that the president could take military action outside of a declaration of war. Adams also established a precedent which was rather unfortunate for him, and that's the fact that he lost his bid for a second term. Thomas Jefferson defeated him, but Adams established the precedent when a president loses an election, they peacefully and willingly hand over power to their successor. Now, let's talk about the creation of political parties. This is called the first party system of the United States. It's the first 2 political parties. And the Constitution has no mention of political parties. The delegates knew that parties existed. They had them in Britain, but they found them to be very divisive, and they found that they really made governing difficult. So they didn't really want to see those parties emerge in the United States. Washington's administration was technically nonpartisan or no party. He did not officially declare himself to be a partisan, But certain foreign policy events from part one of this lecture, like the Jay Treaty, which was highly controversial, and the Neutrality Proclamation, which said we won't take sides between Britain and France, led to the emergence of political parties because Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and their supporters vehemently disagreed about how the national government should be set up. So the first political party was organized by Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasurer. Hamilton was a brilliant political thinker and said, we need a party in place if we're going to get our views passed. He called it the Federalist Party because he wanted to link it to the old Federalists, which had pushed for the ratification of the Constitution. Hamilton wanted to create a connection between the Federalist Party and the Federalists who supported the Constitution. And that's because the Federalists supported a strong national government, and they wanted the Constitution to create a national government that had some power to do things and to ensure law and order in the United States. Foreign relation-wise, the Federalists leaned towards Britain because that made more sense from an economic point of view. They supported Jay's Treaty when that came out. The regions you find the Federalists in were primarily in the northern states, especially in New England and New York. Federalists tended to be supporters, or the supporters of the Federalists tended to be your economic, your political, and your social elite, your commercial elite, your bankers, your merchants, your shippers, people that did business. Those were Hamilton's peeps, and those were the people that supported his party with its strong views of a strong national government. The Democratic Republican Party, which Ms. Oberly typed as Republican, is the opposition to that. And the Democratic Republican Party, or more commonly called the Republican Party, was founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison because they said, Hamilton's getting organized to form a party to get his policies carried out. We need to form a party to oppose that. The Republican Party took its views from this idea of republicanism, that people elect representatives and the representatives should follow the will of the people. Their view of the national government was that it should be very limited and that the state government should have more power because they're closer to the people. Republicans opposed the Jay Treaty. They strongly supported France. They opposed the quasi-war with France. And they are stronger in your more agricultural regions. In the Northwest Territory, which was called the Western United States at that time, and then among the planters of the South. They're more of a working class party, small independent farmers, and the planters. That's who the supporters of the Republican Party were. Federalists were more your elites. Republicans were more your everyday people. So the two sides immediately clashed over economic policy because Hamilton and the Federalists proposed this plan to shape the United States into becoming a commercial economy. They wanted us to be a nation of business, modeled after Britain. And that plan had two key components that Hamilton said were essential, and he threw these to George Washington. The first is called the Bank of the United States. He wanted Congress to create a national bank which would collect the tax revenues for the U.S. government, hold those revenues, and then use that money to issue loans to individuals who were in commercial endeavors like business people. So the Bank of the United States was designed to hold the federal government's money and distribute that money in a way that would make us a stronger commercial power. He also talked about what's called assumption of state debts, because after the American Revolution, the state governments had debts to their citizens, they had debts to other countries, and nobody was lending us money. Nobody would give us credit because the states weren't paying those debts back, or at least some of them weren't. So Hamilton said that the new national government should assume responsibility for those state debts, pay those debts off, so that our national government gets credit, and that the American people will loan it money knowing it'll get paid back, and foreign countries will loan us money. He said we can't operate as a government if nobody trusts us and our credit is bad. So we can't let the states ruin that. We need to take that responsibility. Jefferson typically opposed Hamilton's plan on economic reform for the United States. Jefferson's vision of America was a nation of small, independent, self-sufficient farmers. He said, we are not a nation of business people. We don't need to develop business. That's what Britain does. We're Americans. We go out into the frontier. We carve out our existence, and we are self-sufficient. So he didn't see the need for a Bank of the United States. He also opposed the assumption of state debts because a lot of the debts had been already paid off by the southern states. It was states like New York and Massachusetts that were problematic. And he said, well, Hamilton's from New York. He's just taking care of his own problems. This isn't a national need that we have to address because we're going to be taxing Southerners and Westerners to pay Northern debts. So the two have to compromise again. And boy, did Miss Oberly have some typos in this. The compromise is this. Jefferson said, I will support your program if you move the national capital into the South. I want it out of New York and away from the Hamilton's influence in business people. Hamilton compromised and agreed. He said, fine, we'll move it into the South and eventually what will become Washington, D.C. So the capital was moved from New York City to the District of Columbia, where it was under Southern watch, and Hamilton got his economic plan passed. That was the first big compromise of Washington's administration. Another problem that emerged was the battle over order and liberty in the United States. How do we tackle this problem of individual rights versus public safety? How do we balance these two things out? And when the Quasi-War went on, there were a lot of protests and a lot of criticisms of John Adams by Republicans who were very loudly anti-war with France. And Adams and the Federalists felt like that posed a threat to America's efforts to maintain safety. They were afraid these Republicans were going to call for people to rise up and revolt against his government. So they passed a series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts were designed to keep the country as a whole safe. And they put limits on free press and free speech when it was critical of the government. And they limited those rights, which are protected in the Bill of Rights. But they said there have to be some limits on speech and press if it threatens the stability of the country. And so the Alien and Sedition Acts had a chilling effect on criticism of the Federalist and Adams administration. The Republicans, led by Jefferson, championed individual liberty, individual rights. And they said that no limit should be placed on those freedoms that are in the Bill of Rights. And any government that does so, Federalist, was being a tyrannical government, and that Adams was seeing himself as a monarch. So Jefferson and Madison wrote a series of proposals called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. They authored them anonymously. They were approved by the Kentucky and Virginia state legislatures. They don't go anywhere, but what they call for is they argue that state governments have the right to void out any federal laws like the Alien and Sedition Acts within their borders if they feel those laws are contrary to the Constitution. So the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions are putting forward the idea that state governments are the protector of individual rights. And if the national government exceeds its authority, it's up to the state governments to stop it. So with that said, let's talk about Washington's farewell address, because when George Washington leaves office, right before these political parties start, he issues a warning to the country. He writes this letter. He actually has Hamilton write it for him, and then he puts his name on it and does some edits. But Washington's farewell address was a letter to the nation, and that letter said two things. One, that we need to stay out of European affairs. We shouldn't get involved in European politics. We can trade with Europe, but we shouldn't get involved in anything else because their wars are their wars and they're going to drag us in and it's going to be problematic. This established a policy the United States will follow for the next 100 years called isolationism, where we pretty much politically keep out of the world's affairs. The other thing that Washington argued is no political parties. He said they're divisive, they're going to prove to be destructive, they're going to split the American people and ruin this brand new government that we had. As you know, Washington's second warning wasn't as successful because Jefferson and Hamilton were already forming political parties at that time. So just a reminder that our objective, she forgot that slide, is by the end of this unit, you'll be able to explain why the political ideas, institutions like political parties and party systems developed and changed under the Washington and Adams governments. Talk about precedents, talk about challenges they faced and why those challenges led to the political consequences that they did. As always, thank you for watching this lesson and have a great day.